Hi there, my name's Alec Christie. I'm a PhD student at the University of Cambridge, and today I want to talk to you about how biased evidence is hampering biodiversity conservation efforts. So my PhD focuses on a project called Conservation Evidence, and this is a massive scale effort to collate all the evidence, all the scientific evidence that quantitatively tests the effectiveness of different conservation interventions. This is done using something called subject-wide evidence synthesis, and if you're interested in that, you can search for on the Conservation Evidence website, and that will give you some links to actually how this process is conducted. But essentially, what this online database holds is lots of evidence, scientific summaries of scientific studies that have tested different conservation interventions. And what I did was I looked at the metadata behind this database, and I said, okay, how much evidence is there in different locations for different taxa, and what are the biases and gaps in our knowledge of what works in conservation? So what I'm going to show you now is what these gaps are. So here in the second section, you can see some maps. So these maps, if we just focus on the top left panel here, these maps are for birds, and they're looking at all the studies that have tested conservation actions on birds and where they were in the world. And as you can hopefully appreciate, there's massive clusters from countries in Europe, Western Europe, North America, and Australasia. And actually, for both birds and amphibians, the pattern's really the same, that you've got these massive clusters constituting anything from 84 to 90% of studies in those three regions. And there's big gaps in Africa, South America, and Asia and Russia. And then if we look at these other panels, all I want you to take away from these is that these bottom two are so each of these panels is a different type of study design, so an experimental design. The bottom two are generally considered more rigorous in conservation than these other three designs. And hopefully what you can just appreciate is that outside of these regions, the studies that do exist tend to be of these less rigorous designs. So not only do we lack evidence in these regions, outside of these three regions here, but we also lack the evidence that's available tends to be of poor quality. And if we just move down to the bottom here, these three panels are just looking at the relationship between, in these locations for these grid cells, the number of studies that have been testing conservation actions and the number of species. And I hope what we'd like to see actually is a positive relationship, especially between the number of studies and threatened species, so that we're actually testing conservation actions where threatened species exist, so where we should be prioritising our conservation efforts. And actually we don't see that in fact for both amphibians and birds. So this is just for birds here, but that there's actually a significantly negative relationship, or practically there's no relationship there. So there's a big mismatch between where we're testing conservation actions and where we need to be testing them, essentially. We can also look up here, there's severe taxonomic gaps. So this is just looking at the relative over or underrepresentation of different bird orders in conservation. And basically the darker colours are, darker red colours are underrepresented and the darker blue colours overrepresented. And essentially, and there are also these in red, these names in red mean that those orders are actually absent from the evidence base. So essentially all we want to take away from that is that there's big gaps taxonomically as well, and big biases too. And actually we also did a further analysis looking sort of on where practitioners are likely to conduct their conservation actions in the future. And what we found is that there's, on average, if you look at how many studies there are in a given radius of a practitioner, there tends to be very few, often on average less than one study within 2,000 kilometres. So there's very little locally relevant evidence. So to conclude, there's big gaps in our knowledge of what works in conservation. There's a big mismatch between where we test conservation actions and where we need to implement them. And ultimately, we need to improve the evidence base, and to make evidence-based decisions in conservation, we really need to get better at improving the evidence base, assessing the strength and relevance of evidence to local practitioner settings, and making funders, practitioners and scientists work more closely together to make sure that we can bridge the science practice gap in conservation. Thanks for listening, and if you've got any questions, do contact me. Here are my details up here.